Hi everyone. This is so hard to believe, but this is the last new content for the semester. Remember, we would have ended the semester with in-class presentations of all of the mock exhibitions, but that has now been moved to Canvas. And so this is the last new material. It is week 13, Nature and Science in Modern Art. And that means for the final exam, which will open next week, the final exam will be Units 5 and Units 6. All right, I've modified our guiding questions here just to take into account the kind of different context of modernity. How do artists respond to and incorporate elements of nature and science into their artworks? How do artists use natural material in their artworks? And how do they respond to the environmental crises of the current era in their artwork? So I'm thinking about things like climate change and the modern environmental movement. We're going to start with the Renaissance. And remember that the word Renaissance simply means rebirth. Now, what is being reborn? This is an interest in classical antiquity, so an interest in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. The Renaissance in Europe, the high point is about the mid-15th to the mid-16th centuries. And part of the Renaissance also is encompassed in this idea of humanism. It's a life philosophy, and humanists were scholars, philosophers, writers, artists, politicians, lawyers of the day. And they were concerned with the human experience. They wanted to understand human thought, human reason, but in a religious context. Humanists don't reject Christianity, but it's a way to bring kind of ancient philosophy and Christian theology together. They found Greek and Roman lost literary works and translated them. They emphasized human intellect and reason over the medieval emphasis on divine powers and mysticism, and this has a huge role in the arts because instead of being thought of as mere crafts workers who worked in workshops as kind of anonymous makers, individual artists began to be celebrated as geniuses, people like Michelangelo or Leonardo. And along with this, we see an influence of science. Artists who are developing scientific mathematical systems called perspective or linear perspective as a way to give the illusion of spatial depth on a flat 2D painting. But we're going to turn to Leonardo because I think his journals are fascinating, and I really hope that you enjoyed looking through these cool digitized copies of his journals. He is the quintessential Renaissance man. For him, there is no gap between the sciences or the arts. He did it all. He was always experimenting, always curious, always inventing. One of the first things that we notice about these journal pages, though, might be the writing. Did you pick up on this when you were looking at them? He wrote in mirror image cursive, and we can see that. I think here is maybe the best example of that, the clearest example. It's possibly done to keep his ideas a secret. We're going to hear about some of his scientific ideas in particular were at odds with the doctrine of the Catholic Church at the time. But it was also done as a practicality because Leonardo was left-handed. Who is left-handed? Who knows how difficult it is to live in a right-handed world when you are a lefty, right? The desks aren't made for you, scissors aren't made for you, and if you're working with an inkwell and a quill pen, using writing from left to right as a lefty means you're constantly smearing your own handwriting. So it might just be a practical thing. We're looking at his drawings of a fetus and a human dissection, and these are models for scientific illustrations today. At the time, Leonardo's working for the Duke of Milan and actually did not complete very many paintings, but instead he was working on his scientific theories, on his ideas that we see here. So here we have we show this interest in understanding the human body, the human form. On this page, we also see that he worked as a kind of military engineer. We see very early designs for a tank and then a multiple barrel gun. And this one is perhaps the most stunning. Here at the end of the 15th century, we see Leonardo essentially inventing a very early version of the helicopter. It's a flying machine with a bowl-shaped helicopter. This is meant to be 40 feet across. And someone here in the center who operated these paddles. It's almost like a stair stepper machine. And so he would move the paddles with his feet to propel the flying machine. Now, this was not actually constructed and successful, but we can see how Leonardo was just thinking way out of the box for his time period. This is possibly the most famous illustration from his journal. This is called the Vitruvian Man. Now, it's named after an ancient writer, Vitruvius, who wrote about placing the human figure at the center of a perfectly ordered universe, one that is rational, organized, symmetrical. And here we see how Leonardo provides us that illustration with a man who is circumscribed here in both a circle and square, the two perfect geometrical forms. All right, let's jump ahead a little bit and look at this painting from Rembrandt. So Rembrandt moves to Amsterdam, this economically booming city in the early 17th century, and he's offered a commission to complete a group portrait of the Amsterdam Surgeons Guild. And this is now known today as the Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp. To understand how radical, how much Rembrandt changed the course of art history, I think we need to compare this to an earlier group portrait to understand how different Rembrandt approached this problem. Look at how earlier it almost kind of feels like we see 6 different individual portraits that are just kind of cut and pasted together. Whereas Rembrandt creates a collection of figures that are all engaging with each other. We see different emotional expressions. We see a greater sense of dynamism, of interaction, of liveliness. They interact with each other in a real and coherent way as opposed to this earlier model of group portraits. Now, Dr. Nicholas Tulp, this guy here, he was appointed a professor of the Amsterdam Anatomy Guild. And one of those responsibilities was to deliver a public lecture on some aspect of human anatomy. And the lecture occurred in 1632, the year of this painting, on the 16th of January. And this is what Rembrandt is depicting to us. Oh my gosh. The focal point, of course, is Dr. Tulp. He's the doctor. He's pointing out the flexors in the cadaver's arm to us. And he's also the only person who wears a hat. But each individual here displays a facial expression that is deeply personal and psychological. And I'm just giving you one example here of this figure in the back. So I think it really draws us in still today, hundreds of years later. The body here, the cadaver, is laid out in full view. It was a recently executed thief. And then at his feet, in that detail here in the right corner, we see a copy of an anatomy book. This is Andreas Vesalius's Fabric of the Human Body that's propped up in the lower right corner. This book was first published in the 16th century, and we can see this kind of tool being incorporated here. Now, this type of painting would only be possible in a Protestant region. I mentioned earlier that Leonardo came into conflict with the Catholic Church for some of his ideas that he expressed in his journals, because of the Catholic belief in the resurrection of all souls and the final judgment day. It necessitated that dead bodies needed to be interred in a state of wholeness, and so that's why Leonardo dissected human bodies in secret And that's why this group painting that shows us the dissection of a cadaver could only be possible in a Protestant section of Europe. And Holland at the time was Protestant. In fact, human dissections were not only common practice in Holland, but they were often public spectacles. In fact, a lot of times they included a buffet, wine, music. It was a social, occurrence. And here we see just a kind of little snippet of what that might have been like. The signature is behind this top figure here, again in that detail here on the top right. It's very prominent, and Rembrandt must have been proud of this large, intricate group painting. And here we see in Latin, Rembrandt tells us Rembrandt made it. And it really is a watershed moment in Rembrandt's career because he becomes the painter, the most sought after painter for large commissions in the city of Amsterdam after this work.